individual species organizations matters. You've got people really passionate. I mean, Jonathan is sort of the radical intrinsic. If it's not totally endangered and there's 10 left, then he loses interest. But he's very but he totally inspires people to hang on a sec, oh, that's right, that has value, that has life. And he's crazy enough to actually care and actually do something, and then hopefully you'll get people crazy enough to actually fund it. But this general biodiversity thing, and even the threats, and it's all very abstract to most people. And I think it's not a neither nor. Species belong in an ecosystem. If we can help save frogs, there'll be other creatures living with it, or whatever the case is. I think everyone gets that. But I think where species do fit in, it makes it real to people. And passionate people caring about animals is contagious. We all learn from example. You teach your kids by example. It makes a big difference. And I think the world would be much purer if Bugs Life went out of business and WWF got Bugs Life, tiny little amount of money they get every year. So I believe in biodiversity. I believe in biodiversity in our area, in every area. You specialist little areas. It's not a neither nor story. I don't think it's a debate between one or the other. And one more point. It's almost like being a very thirsty person standing by the sea. That's sort of our situation. Because this idea of no resources and triage, there's tons of, how much money has the World Bank got ready to save Greece? There is so much money floating around this planet. We all believe there's limited resources. There's limited resources towards life. It's not about no money. The transfer spending window in the UK, you name it, wherever you go, Munch's painting, the irony of it is $120 million for a two-dimensional picture of a man screaming for the destruction of nature. That's 5 times more than the World Bank Species Fund is getting. So I think these are false choices that we're just reinforcing by even talking about them.
Thank you. Now I'm going to walk over to the public sector guys and ask them to respond. So Gustavo, you said that during the 5th replenishment to the GEF, you were able to add species conservation as a strategic outcome. How did you convince governments, many of whom were beginning to feel the heat of the financial crisis at that time, or it was just before it, how did you convince them to do species conservation? And is it enough to say to them, they're species, I'm an intrinsic, it matters, this is about life? Is that an argument that works for the public sector? I'm going to ask Fred the same question. Oh.
Thank you. There's the official version and the unofficial version. The official version is that governments finally realized that they should do something for species, and we got a couple of countries to actually lead that opinion, and eventually it became a guidance to the GEF. The unofficial version is that we got into the negotiating room and said, look, we are really interested in doing this if you just tell us that you want us to do this, and that's how we can move together. But on the question, why do we need species conservation? It came to me like looking at the portfolio of the GEF that goes from the very soft projects on the biodiversity side, everything's called biodiversity, all the way to very laser-focused projects dealing with species in Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, the last remaining habitat for species. And we need to do species conservation because it's intrinsically, fundamentally different from doing biodiversity conservation in the larger sense. Of course, ecosystem services provide resources for poor people, and there's lots of interdependencies there, and we know that. But addressing these needs of provision of ecosystem services will not do the trick for threatened species. So conversely, you can do a lot of good locally by introducing measures to conserve threatened species and making the connection and having some local benefits. But it's not sufficient to build the argument that intervention on species conservation will make the difference for poverty reduction and that. So unless we make the conscious decision that if we want to save species, we're going to have a different approach for them, then we have, let's say, to stop the deterioration of ecosystems, the fragmentation of standing ecosystems, so that the more threatened species are produced as opposed to saving the ones that are threatened now. We're not going to do this job. So we need to have different approaches, and trying to argue that looking at the broader landscape, doing ecosystem services is going to save threatened species, we are kidding ourselves. That's why we need to have that other approach. Without it, I think that I'm mostly doomed.
Yeah, I mean, the private sector or the public sector, I mean, I can answer maybe two sides of the same question with basically the same individual who is behind the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund. If you address the person as an head of state who is in charge of the government, we've got auditors, we've got lawyers, we've got backers, we've got stakeholders to please, to report, to justify, to analyze, to rationalize, and to try to be transparent, to try to explain why an investment is done in some area of a government. And then, so we go through the motion. Either willingly or forcibly, we have to go through the motion. And it doesn't matter how powerful you are, you have to go through that. So you take a number of decisions which are based on what people expect you to take as a decision, as well as how people expect you to manage this decision. And that add a lot of constraints, of challenges, and I would say restriction. So in the case of species conservation, in the United Arab Emirates and the Abu Dhabi government, we've got serious requirement. We've got restriction, we've got reporting requirements, we've got, as I said, audit and all these kind of things, and we change us as best practice or world class, like everybody wants us to follow now. So we have reservation and restriction. And then the same person, in its personal capacity, basically decides, what the heck with that? This is what I'm supposed to do, as Ada said. As an individual, I just want to do that way, the way I like, and I don't need anybody to tell me why or how I should be doing that. And that's to say, you have this ambivalence sometimes in every one of us as individual working in institution that require this kind of behavior, what we would do as an individual. And I think this is what motivates a lot of people to actually, if they were free to do the choice they want to do, they would support species. They don't need a rationalization. It's ingrained. Some people are not interested in species, that's something else. As Adam said, they can be interested in the art or sports, and they can put millions of that. Nobody is asking them to justify why they want. That's their personal choice. And I think a lot of the intrinsic or people looking at philanthropy are actually motivated by that factor. And I think institutionally, we try to overcomplicate and try to over-rationalize why we decide to do that. And I think species is actually suffering from that. We see that in IUCN or in other conservation organizations, the amount of time and effort which goes into trying to justify every single work we want to do is actually a huge waste of resources, and sometimes we reach a point where it's totally counterintuitive. We know we are doing the wrong thing, but we think we have to do it because I don't know exactly why. So it takes some time. Individuals who have the freedom, you need to have this freedom to actually go against that trend, to actually show that actually you can do the things in a different way. And I think, I know personally, having worked in that environment for a long time, that sometimes you find this dichotomy in the same person. And I know that all of us, being working in conservation, we have that every day, in our official capacity versus in our personal capacity.
So let's see if we have the dichotomy. I agree. Let's see if we have that dichotomy in the room. Hands up, intrinsics in the room. People who think that species matter because it's about life, it's about a values argument.
That's a biased crowd.
No, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Okay, keep your hand up only if you have applied for funding for a particular species conservation program based on an intrinsic argument. Okay, so I want to hear
And
some.
how
of
many
these-
get the money?
Yeah, okay, so keep your hands up. That's a very good question. Keep your hands up if your proposal was successful.
Well, it depends. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not.
Okay, well, if you have a good story. Hang on. Okay, let's take a couple of stories here. You want to start? You were successful?
Well, in part, but sometimes not. Yeah, because we really went through times, and I'm so happy to hear that maybe minds and views are changing, where if there was no profit for women, if there was no poverty alleviation, if there wasn't whatever, no chance, you know, and you really try to put all these things into your project proposal because you knew if you don't have these keywords in your project application, then forget it. But if it comes to species, there are so many species around where we won't have the time and not the chance to try to solve all these problems. I mean, we can't solve all these kind of problems in the world if we have species where we have the last 10 individuals and you need like €3,000 to put up some kind of a, let's say, captive breeding facility or things. And this is really a problem. I mean, I'm not talking of big projects. I'm talking of sometimes just seed money. Sometimes it just takes a couple of hundred or even just €1,000 or dollars, and you can achieve big things and buy time and hope that through, let's say, EU money, these whole big problems are solved. But you know, in species conservation, sometimes we have only little time to do something.
Thank you, sir. Very interesting. Let me hand it over here to somebody else who I saw was someone who applied successfully using the intrinsic argument. Why did you make the intrinsic argument? Why didn't you make the poverty alleviation or gender or climate change argument?
Thanks, Melanie. I think you don't always have to make it. I mean, it depends who you're approaching to. I think if you've asked who'd gone to a public sector donor and made those kind of arguments, we might have seen a more limited show of hands. I mean, where we've had success in my former life of applying for funds, it's been to private foundations usually, some foundations that are specific on species conservation, private individuals, interested high net worth individuals. And you don't have to make an argument, all the points have been well made. You know, the world is richer because we share it with so many other forms of life, and it's poorer if we lose those forms of life. We can never replace those. I think that's what motivates most of us to be conservationists. But we don't always use that language in our work because it's, you know, we fear that that isn't what the public sector wants to hear, that what government doesn't want to hear. But the people who are the constituents of government, they have the same values. So perhaps we need to speak that language a little bit more.
Is there anybody here who successfully applied for species funding using an intrinsic argument to the public sector? Anybody want to say why they didn't do that if they applied? Okay, gentleman down here, another one over here.
Thank you. Philip Reardon from the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University. I think I'm an intrinsic, and I think if you take the argument to its logical conclusion, then we would have, you know, a list of species that are being worked on throughout the world, and donors such as yourselves maybe could just consult that list and say, okay, well the arguments are well made. Everyone knows why we're conserving snow leopard or trying to in China at the moment, or African lion. You know, we all know, we intrinsically know, that's by definition, yes? And so you just have a long list of all the species, all the countries at which the action is being carried out, and donors can just pick and choose. Where that argument then fails is that, well, what makes the difference between those projects? And the difference is their capacity to succeed, to carry out the work that they say they wish to carry out. And where does that capacity come from? Well, that then is the engagement within the country in which they're working, with the communities or the governments. And at that point, that's where we then have to make the less intrinsic argument. Then we have to start coming in with the poverty alleviation arguments, the ecosystem service arguments, and because that's the language at that level that we would have to speak. And so I agree that the intrinsic argument should flow, and it should be the main basis by which we decide the priorities for resource funding. But I think it fundamentally fails at that very level.
Thank you. We have another gentleman.
Well, I can speak in English, but it's better if I do it in Spanish. So if you put your thing on, it would be great. It's a story. Okay, it's a story. A finales de los años 90, cerca de 1999, yo soy Guillermo Rodríguez, trabajo en la Fundación Pro Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. La Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta es tal vez uno de los ecosistemas más increíbles que hay en el mundo. Tenemos la nieve a tan solo 42 kilómetros del mar. Tenemos todos los biomas que se pueden encontrar en la América tropical, tenemos culturas indígenas, tenemos culturas campesinas. Mejor dicho, nosotros logramos convencer al Jeff de que era un sitio importante para hacer sus inversiones. Nos obtuvimos un Jeff de medium size, que es tamaño medio, pero pues se necesitaba un apoyo del gobierno y pues el Banco Mundial estaba manejando eso y vio como una oportunidad muy grande que la contrapartida que debía poner el país lo hicieran a través de un Learning and Innovation Loan. Con este Learning and Innovation Loan, todo un proceso que se había hecho de consulta con las comunidades indígenas y con los campesinos, pues habíamos logrado realmente tener todo listo, ya estaba todo listo, faltaba el aporte del gobierno y el Banco Mundial dijo, con este préstamo hacemos el componente que nos falta, que es el del fortalecimiento institucional. Al introducir ese nuevo elemento, no consultado con toda la gente, los primeros que se opusieron fueron los indígenas y dijeron, y salió primero la plata del Learning and Innovation Loan, que se hiciera efectivo el Jeff. Empezó a ejecutarse esto y los indígenas dijeron, bueno, ¿cómo sucede esto? Y esto no lo consultan, entonces ellos hicieron que se congelara ese Jeff. De todas maneras quedó armado toda una estrategia de conservación, uniendo parches de bosques, la biodiversidad es enorme. Hubo unos problemas de orden público muy grandes en Colombia que pues en realidad tuvo que detenerse eso. De todas maneras quedaron todos estos trabajos y quedó toda esta información y comenzamos a tratar de revivir después de todos estos problemas de tráfico, de narcotráfico, de guerrilla, a poner otra vez a vivir estas iniciativas de conservación. Hemos logrado en muchas zonas que llevamos más de 20 años trabajando, que la gente sea consciente del valor de la biodiversidad. Hemos logrado empezar a unir parches de bosque, hemos recuperado hábitats, por ejemplo una especie en vía de extinción que es el pauquín de pico azul, el blueback curazao. Logramos que ese hábitat se restaurara, pero después de eso hemos buscado todos los mecanismos, ya sea a través de conservación de cuencas, son unas torres de agua, hay 36 ríos de las cuales dependen más de 2 millones de habitantes. Hemos buscado que nos apoyen a través del Paujil. Disney tiene un programa para apoyar especies, pero no hemos logrado realmente encontrar un apoyo, y todo este esfuerzo que se está haciendo o que se ha hecho durante mucho tiempo y que las mismas comunidades han sido conscientes, no está siendo valorado, ¿sí? Y no hemos encontrado el mecanismo de conseguir unos recursos donde se valore este trabajo. Y yo creo que ustedes, estas agencias que están ahora con un Jeff 5, ¿sí? Porque yo creo que el mío era como Jeff 1, entonces tienen allá un ejemplo, un sitio donde podrían sacar muchas experiencias, y yo creo que sería muy valioso, ¿sí? Que los tuvieran en cuenta y miraran y revisaran toda esa experiencia ya que están empezando a lanzar un programa nuevo, donde ahorita tenemos dos especies, ¿sí? Que son una rana, una pequeña rana que es endémica de la Sierra Nevada, no la hay en otra parte, y el pauquín de pico azul, que creo que también el endemismo es en la sierra, y estamos en un momento en que pues se está perdiendo todo ese trabajo y estamos a punto de perder ese hábitat que se está recuperando. Entonces creo que hay experiencias ya hechas, hay trabajo hecho que valdría la pena que revisaran para proponer unos nuevos programas.
So we've heard a lot of different reasons why we either apply using an intrinsic argument or we apply to different people using different arguments. But I'm going to go back to the panel on something that Jean-Christophe asked, is what makes a compelling and convincing proposal? We're very lucky here because there's several people on the panel who have funds who give out money. They're reading your proposals. So can you help us understand what makes a good, compelling and convincing proposal, or what's wrong with the proposals you've seen? JC, you want to start?
I can start actually because I am fundraising, so and I struggle to actually mobilize extra funding for SOS. This funding can go in turn